Hi, this is Richard Grieco for Run It Once Puzzle Solvers, and in this episode we're going to take a look at how to handle the situation where you check as the out of position player and face a bet from the player contesting the pot against you in position. So let's take a look at where we are so far. When we are facing a bet from the in-position player, we're going to need to do a couple of things. We're going to need to make sure that we check call and check raise at a high enough frequency that in-position doesn't get to increase their bet frequency as an exploit. If they know that we're overfolding, obviously they're going to start doing more betting. And equally, if they know that we're check calling at a reasonably high frequency, but check raising very infrequently, then that's not going to disincentivize them from increasing their betting frequency either, because they don't really have a worst case scenario in that instance. Like, the worst thing that can really happen is that they build the pot against us in position when the range that we're check calling has a component that is large in size, that is typically capped across quite a few different runouts. So that whole situation is not going to go particularly badly for them, and likely they're going to initiate an aggressive strategy in order to get to future streets where they can take advantage of that to the greatest extent. We're also going to need to make sure that, as well as check raising, often enough we check raise the right types of hands. If our range is too value heavy, then in position will start to overfold and our strong value hands won't win as much as they're theoretically entitled to. And we're going to want to make sure that the construction of our check raise range, especially at high SPR, is quite polarized. We clearly don't want to start check raising a lot of mid-strength hands that retain equity poorly against an in-position range that we've now tightened considerably. So, high equity value hands that retain equity well, nutted semi-bluffs, and for our bluffs, mostly combinations with useful removal effects to the top of in-position's range. So, weak top pairs, combinations like that. If we imagine our check raise range as existing along this spectrum, with strongest hands to the far left-hand side, weakest hands along to the right, then we're not going to want to check raise our very weakest hands, because those likely have no useful removal effects or characteristics which can increase their EV as bluffs on future streets. So it's mainly going to be hands at the top of our range for value, and then in that we will also include the highest equity semi-bluffs. And then towards the middle, not quite good enough to check call, but good enough to put some money into the pot with and have some characteristics which might mean that their EV as bluffs is considerably higher than their raw equity, if you consider them in that way. If we do check raise a range that's too linear, then we run into major issues on future streets. We can occasionally run out of bluffs if the board rolls off relatively unchanged in nature from the flop, if we don't have any flop bluffs to begin with. We can also just end up running out of value combinations on certain boards, which change the nuts considerably in a sort of relatively low frequency way. Either way, if our range starts out polarized, then our opponent has no clear counter strategy against it. And fortunately for us, a lot of the other elements of out of position strategy against in-position bet are pretty intuitive. It's very, very natural to check call hands towards the middle of our range. They're clearly too good to check fold. And they don't make a great deal of sense as check raises. It's also pretty intuitive, I think, to check fold our very weakest hands, our complete airballs. And so what we're going to do for the remainder of this video is focus on two of the components of the out of position response strategy, which might come a little less intuitively. Those being check calling hands, which are pretty strong, and check raising hands, which are pretty weak as bluffs. So before we can accurately implement the idea of check calling some pretty strong hands, it's necessary to gain a solid fundamental understanding of why it is that we do so. Because if we don't know what our objective is, what we're trying to achieve, then either we won't do it ever because it will seem as if it has minimal value, or if we get the idea that we're probably supposed to have some strong hands in our check call range but aren't clear about what we're trying to accomplish, then it's likely that we'll end up check calling a few almost at random, based on our mood as much as any other factor, because if we don't understand what we're trying to achieve, then any one hand will seem as good for purpose as any other. A decent place to start, I think, is by getting rid of a relatively common misconception, which will go along the lines of, my hand wins the most money, value, chips, whatever, if I check raise. But I'm going to call here instead because I want to protect my calling range. And this is a fundamental misconception of how solvers approach the game. Solvers are not going to sacrifice EV in order to accomplish something. This is not a chess game where you might sacrifice a piece in order to achieve a broader strategic objective. If accomplishing something costs the solver EV, then they'll either figure out a different way to do it in which it does not cost them EV, or they'll find a workaround for not having that element in their strategy overall. They're just not going to do it. And it kind of logically follows then that if solvers do check call strong hands at a reasonable frequency, and solvers are never going to give up EV, then check calling strong hands must frequently win the most EV. And a decent place to drill down into why that is to consider the main ways in which hands are actually going to generate EV. So there's the straightforward approach. We can just start betting and raising as quickly as possible, hopefully getting action from hands against which we do pretty well. We can start betting and raising and achieve something slightly different. We can maybe have a hand that has less overwhelming equity, but will, as a consequence of taking aggressive action, force our opponents to fold hands with some reasonable amount of value against our overall range, and thereby deny equity to some certain elements of their range and add that value to our own strategy. We can also look to generate EV in less aggressive ways. We can check or call, and by doing so, having somewhat underrepresented the strength of our hand, potentially induce aggression on future streets from our opponent with a range against which our hand performs very well. We can also check or call, and by doing so, deny our opponent the ability to fold. And by keeping them in the pot, especially if we have a hand against which elements of their range are drawing near dead, we can leave open the possibility that they will, at some later stage, make a hand good enough to put some money in as the caller and pay us off. And that, I think, demonstrates that not all strong hands are going to make the most money by taking the straightforward approach and betting and raising as aggressively as possible, as early as possible in the hand. Often by taking a less aggressive option on some early street, you end up making more overall EV, not only because our opponent remains in the pot with a weaker range, but because having underrepresented your hand, you may cause him to overplay elements of his. And it's also useful to point out that strong is a term which has a flexible meaning within the context of a hand of poker. It's possible for hands to vary significantly in value, even if they have the same actual rank. So, for example, top two pair, middle set, can all have considerably different value in different circumstances. For example, if we have bottom set on 9-5 deuce rainbow against under the gun, we have a much stronger hand than if we have bottom set against button on Jack 8-5 flush draw. On Jack 8-5 flush draw, button's going to have more hands with higher EV against combinations such as bottom set. He's also simply going to have jacks and eights at a higher frequency. Whereas when we have bottom set against under gun on 9-5 deuce, it's extremely rare that he's going to show up with a better made hand at the moment, and he's going to struggle to find very many hands with much equity against us. He's mainly going to be forced to continue with combinations such as overpairs with a backdoor flush draw, top pair with some additional backup. The strongest hands he's going to show up with a reasonable frequency are going to be combinations like aces with a gut shot. And in figuring out how aggressive we should look to be with any one combination of any individual strong-made hand, it's useful to consider them as fitting into one or other of these two categories. Firstly, there are hands which benefit most from betting and raising aggressively, taking the straightforward approach, and those can be thought of as hands which do well forcing aggression. Alternatively, there are hands which benefit from playing a little bit slower, controlling the size of the pot, keeping our opponent's range wider, and those can be thought of as hands which do best absorbing aggression. And so let's talk a little bit more about how to figure out which of those categories to place any single hand into. Well, a characteristic that hands which frequently want to force aggression will have is that they have added equity. They not only are a strong made hand currently, but they have additional merit. They have the potential to grow even stronger on relatively frequently occurring texture shifts. By contrast, hands which do well absorbing aggression are often significantly devalued on those texture shifts. So they're kind of one-dimensional in nature. They're a strong made hand at the moment, but they're not much else. They have no other qualities which might cause you to value them highly. And so considering the graphic on the left-hand side, we can see that if we have any set with any redraw on Jack 9-6 Rainbow, then we're check raising more or less all the time. If we remove the redraw and we just have a bare top set combination, then we start playing significantly more passively. Now, there's a clear trend downwards as we decrease the strength of the hand in absolute terms. Like, dry top set is still check raising the majority of the time because even if it has no other qualities, it is still the current nuts. It isn't beaten by anything. As we introduce the possibility for our hand not only to have no added equity, but to be currently beaten, even at a relatively low frequency, then we start playing considerably more passively. Middle set is check calling more than half the time, and bottom set is check calling essentially always. So I think that's a useful reminder that the lower our hand is in the overall hand hierarchy, the quicker we are to turn to passive options, as opposed to continuing to play our hand as fast as we can. And taking a look at some other properties hands may have which could help you separate them into one or other of these categories. Hands which do well forcing aggression are typically going to block the better hands that are possible, if any are, and unblock worse ones. That basically maximizes their chance of getting money in a good situation. They will, at a very low frequency, potentially never run into a better hand. For example, on the left-hand side, Jack 9-9 is doing a lot more check raising when it's dry than 9-9 is as a hand class overall, because we remove combinations of the one hand that we can get a lot of money in against very bad. And we unblock worse combinations. Obviously, if we're check raising a hand, as that check raise grows thinner in absolute terms, then we need to improve the chances that our opponent has as many combinations as possible of worse hands which are still going to put money in against us. Otherwise, the value of our check raise decreases still further. So we can see that if we have 9-9-6, now we start doing a lot less check raising because we block the hand immediately beneath ours. And we not only unblock a set of jacks, but we block a set of sixes. And this can be thought of as having positive removal effects. And by contrast, hands which prefer to absorb aggression are going to have negative removal effects. They're going to unblock all the better hands and block all the worse ones, thereby minimizing their chances of getting money in good should they choose to take aggressive action. And when hands do well absorbing aggression, they're typically going to have marginal equity as they tighten their opponent's range. Their equity isn't going to be retained particularly well as they tighten their opponent's range by turning it from a betting range into a bet calling range. If we have a clear advantage against our opponent's betting range, but that advantage decreases significantly as we increase the size of the pot, then we may prefer to choose not to increase the size of the pot. And so we're going to take a look at a few examples to hopefully make these ideas seem a little clearer in your mind. Firstly, on Jack 9-6 Rainbow, let's consider a bare set of sixes. Well, this combination is going to choose to check call. It has pretty high made hand strength. It only loses to two hands at the moment, but its backup is mediocre at best. It has a backdoor straight draw, which will come in at a pretty low frequency. It has one very low backdoor flush draw. Other than that, it's quite bare in nature. There are a lot of turn cards on which this hand loses a lot of its value. Any of the straight completing cards, and it's in some amount of a tough spot. And so we're going to choose to play this hand slow and just check call it. Now, Jack 9-7-5 does have added equity. It has the 7-5 gut shot, but it's also lower in value. It loses now to all the sets. And so our backup requirements will increase as the strength of our hand decreases. Had we had a combination like 7-6-6-5, then since that's a set and a backdoor straight draw, or a set and a bad straight draw, we're probably going to check raise that hand. But now that we only have top 2 pair, our requirements have increased. Maybe we need an open-ender. And when we have this specific combination, we're still going to choose to check call it. If we strengthen the Jack-9-7-5 by adding an additional backdoor flush draw, now we consider that hand strong enough to check raise. And it goes back the other way. We can have a combination of the current nuts, set of jacks at the bottom, but this hand has very poor removal effects. Not only does it block the set of 9s, but it blocks a ton of potential straight draws that our opponent can have with the 10. And so, since he's going to continue at a significantly lower frequency against check raise when we have the 10 and the 9 in our hand than if we have 2 other side cards, we're going to play this hand slow as well and choose to check call it. And so, summarizing the key points, building large pots out of position when the board is such that the nuts are going to change at a high frequency, flop to turn to river, is something that should be done with quite a lot of caution, because there's no taking it back. Once we've built this large pot out of position, we're going to have to figure out a way to get ourselves out of a lot of tricky situations, and therefore we're going to enter those future streets with a range that is best equipped to handle those texture shifts. We're going to ensure that we have reasonable board coverage on them, and we're going to not have hands in our range which lose a lot of value when these texture shifts occur. When we have a lot of strong hands, we actually do better playing smaller pots against wider ranges, especially those combinations which have negative removal effects and do poorly on texture shifts as we tighten our opponent's range. And check calling has the added benefit of giving us strong hands. It's necessary to emphasize that that isn't our primary objective, but it is something that occurs as a byproduct of check calling a lot of strong hands, that we then have those strong hands in our range when we check call and the board runs off unchanged in nature. When it rolls off a brick on the turn, for example, we're still capable of having strong made hands that can potentially check raise against imposition double barrel. Moving on now to the idea of check raising weaker hands as potential bluffs. When we're considering a check raise bluff, we have 2 main strategic objectives, and those are to limit the aggression that imposition is able to send our way. If he knows that we don't have a robust response strategy against a bet, then they're going to do more betting. And given that a lot of our range wants to see in the next card for free, and also given that any street on which betting occurs, the imposition player has a built-in structural advantage, namely that they act after we do, it's going to be to our advantage to compel them to do as little betting as possible. And so the way in which we accomplish that is by ensuring that they only get to bet as often as the strength of their range entitles them to. Our second objective is just going to be to generate the most value for a particular region of our range, and that is hands which have useful attributes. For example, the future nut flush blocker, or a top pair blocker, or future straight blockers, or the current nut flush blocker, or current straight blocker. But they have bad raw equity. They don't do well if you were to simply see how much equity that particular combination had against an opponent's range, but they do have characteristics which mean that they'll likely be able to over-realize that equity if used aggressively. Those hands do well as check-raise bluffs. And we're going to want to choose hands. Obviously, we're going to have to be quite selective here. We don't want to over-bluff. But we're going to have to choose hands which have as many of these attributes as possible. Firstly, they have pretty reasonable EV if imposition checks back. If that's not the case, then if our range allows us to have a leading frequency, then they might do better as leads. They're going to want to have moderate to low EV if used as check calls. If our hand is a pretty high EV check call, then the probability that it's an even higher EV check raise bluff decreases. Whereas if the value of the alternative option is quite low, or even potentially zero, then it's easier for raising to be the highest value option and therefore the one that we should select. We're going to want to have the ability to either make or block the nut hand on this street or a nut hand which will show up at a high frequency on a future street. If we don't block the nuts, and we can't ever block the nuts on future streets, then we're just kind of building the pot with a hand that has negative removal effects. And we're going to want to have polarity to our future equity distribution, because we're going to want to be able to back up our flop check raise with a reasonable frequency of turn and river aggression. And if having check raise flop, we just start wanting to do a whole bunch of checking on basically every run out, then our hand loses a lot of its effectiveness as a check raise bluff. So we're going to take a few different hands on a variety of boards, and these are all hands that we're going to want to turn into bluffs. I'm going to look into why, and hopefully this will shed some light on the broader strategic and conceptual context. So the board is 994 Rainbow, very dry. There are no viable semi-bluffs. Any check raise range is polar by nature. It's going to be 9x plus for value, and then a variety of hands that we use as bluffs. If we have a combination like 6-5-5-4 with no backdoor flush draw, then this doesn't really have much EV if imposition checks back. Ultimately, it has minimal potential to improve. Can turn the odd backdoor straight draw and such, but even if imposition just has some overcards, those overcards have reasonable equity and are likely to over-realize that equity on future streets. Our hand's pretty low EV as a check call because imposition's range is now tighter, their range is a little bit more polar. We can anticipate future aggression, even if 2-5s are currently the best hand. It's tough to get them to showdown. We block the current nuts with a 4. And we have kind of Hail Mary equity for a relatively strong future hand if we turn or river a 5. And that means that we also have polarity to our future equity distribution. The majority of the time we're going to end up with a very strong hand or a clear bluffing candidate. And a lot of our check raising range on paired boards is going to center around the unpaired card. It's just going to mean that our opponent has some amount fewer combinations of full houses at the moment. Obviously, we don't limit their 9x combinations, but if we're check raising some hands with a little bit of equity against 9x, and we block them having a few combinations that would have us essentially dead, then it's going to work out pretty well. We're also going to want interaction with the paired or unpaired cards, and here we have some backdoor straight draws going on. If we had a couple of backdoor flush draws, our hand would have more EV as a check call, because it would have the ability to absorb aggression on future streets, at least maybe on the turn. But here we don't. We're just going to be forced, if we check call, to check fold basically every turn card when our opponent bets. As such, we don't want the hand to go down that path, and we prefer to turn our hand into a check raise bluff now. Switching up the board, now it's kind of like a dry unpaired board with a Broadway card, so King 7-3 Rainbow. And we consider a hand like King Queen 5-5 with no backdoor flush draw. This hand kind of ticks all the boxes. If imposition checks back, it has pretty reasonable EV because after all it is still top pair and it's unlikely not to be top pair on the next card. If we check call though, our EV decreases significantly because the fact that we have a pocket pair in our range means that we'll turn 2 pair pretty infrequently. And if imposition double barrels on a wide variety of turn cards, basically any turn card besides a queen or a 5, then or a king, then we have an unimproved hand with minimal potential to improve because we don't have a backdoor flush draw. Likely we're going to have to check fold what could be a reasonable amount of equity against our opponent's double barreling range, should we choose to check call flop. We block both the current and future nuts with this particular combination. Obviously, the king blocks combinations of top set. Also top 2 pair, which is like a near nutted hand on this particular board. And the 2 5s in our hand mean that if any of the mid straight cards roll off, we have blockers to that combination or that hand as well. And now let's think about a much more dynamic texture. 8-7-3 flush draws, so multiple straight and flush draws are possible. What do we do if we have a combination such as King, Queen, Jack, Deuce with a tri-suited King High flush draw? Well, if imposition checks back, our EV is kind of reasonable. His range will be capped on some potential, weakened on some potential turn cards. We can obviously just turn a flush at some frequency, Should we turn a king or a queen, we have a little bit of EV because we have top pair and a flush draw. If we check call, our hand loses a lot of its EV because we block our own outs, we unblock Imposition's strongest made hands, we unblock a lot of hands therefore that they're going to double barrel turn with. Should we make our hand, given that it's specifically the king high flush and we have 3 spades in our hand, it may not be the literal nuts, but it is a pretty strong value combination. And there's quite a bit of polarity to our future equity distribution. It's not perfectly polarized. It's possible that we end up with some top pair combinations or something like that. But pretty often we'll have the second nut flush, which with 3 of that suit is a pretty strong value betting hand, or not much of anything at all. And primarily, I think in this instance, because the hand is such a poor check call candidate, we're going to turn this hand into a check raise bluff. And so in conclusion, we can divide our strong made hands into 2 separate categories. Those that are going to do best forcing the aggression, betting and raising as aggressively as they can, as early as they can, and those that are going to prefer to absorb that aggression and take more passive options. The strong made hands we should be the most inclined to check call are those which are often devalued when the turn and river changes the nuts in a way that's going to occur at a pretty high frequency. They're also often typically pushing less equity once they start to narrow their opponent's range, so their equity retention is less effective. And they're going to have negative removal effects. They're going to be worse at getting paid off if they take aggressive action, therefore they're going to be disincentivized from taking that aggressive action. As for check raising weaker hands as bluffs, well, the first thing is that it helps us check raise at a high enough frequency that Imposition doesn't get to bet more often as an exploit. Secondly, it ensures our range isn't so strong that Imposition just gets to fold a bunch of the time and not pay us off. Both of these essentially guard against clear exploitative opportunities for our opponent. And the hands that we choose to use as check raise bluffs should not only have useful removal effects, but a future equity distribution, which means they can back up the flop check raise bluff with high levels of aggression on the turn and the river. That's it for this episode. See you in the next video.